I used to believe that there were two types of people in this world, those who were disciplined and those who were not. The disciplined ones were a different species, forged from some stronger, more resilient material. They were the ones who woke up at dawn to run marathons, who built businesses from scratch, who learned new languages in their spare time. They possessed a mystical quality called willpower, a raw, brute force of character that allowed them to conquer their impulses and bend reality to their ambitions. And then there was me. I was the king of starting things. My home was a museum of abandoned good intentions. In my closet, a pair of expensive running shoes, worn exactly 3 times, sat next to a yoga mat that had never been unrolled. On my bookshelf, a collection of books on finance, coding, and philosophy stood with their spines uncracked, their pages pristine. My computer's hard drive was a digital graveyard of half-finished online courses and ambitious projects that had died a quiet death from neglect. The cycle was always the same, a predictable and heartbreaking pattern. It would begin with a surge of manic inspiration, usually late at night. I would watch a documentary or read an article and become utterly convinced that I had found my new calling. This was it. I was going to become a runner, a coder, an investor. The next day, I would dive in head first, buying all the gear, subscribing to all the newsletters, telling all my friends about my new identity. For a week, maybe 2, I would be a model of dedication. I would feel a sense of pride, a feeling that this time it was different. But then, inevitably, the friction would begin. The initial excitement, that cheap fuel of novelty, would start to burn out. A cold, rainy morning would make the run seem less appealing. A difficult coding problem would feel insurmountable. The initial rush would be replaced by the mundane reality of daily effort. And my motivation would evaporate like mist in the morning sun. The running shoes would go back in the closet. The course would be forgotten. And I would be left once again alone with a familiar, corrosive feeling, the shame of being a failure. I had a deeply ingrained belief about myself. I was lazy. I was undisciplined. I lacked willpower. I saw it as a fundamental character flaw, a stain on my very being. This belief was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I believed I was undisciplined, I never trusted myself to follow through, which made it even easier to quit at the first sign of difficulty. Why bother trying, my inner critic would whisper, when you know you're just going to fail anyway? This internal narrative was my own private hell. It filled me with a sense of frustration and self-loathing that colored everything I did. I felt like I was standing on the shore, watching the ships of my own potential sail away without me on board, simply because I couldn't be bothered to build a raft. The change, the great turning point of my life, did not come from a sudden burst of superhuman willpower. It came from a quiet, desperate admission. My current approach was a complete and total failure. Trying to force myself, to hustle harder, to rely on raw motivation. It was like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. It was exhausting and ultimately futile. I had to accept that my theory about discipline was wrong. This admission created a space for a new idea to enter. And the idea was this: what if discipline wasn't about the strength of your willpower, but about the intelligence of your system? What if the disciplined people weren't a different species? What if they just understood something I didn't? What if they weren't fighting a battle against temptation every day? What if they had simply designed their lives in a way that made the battle unnecessary? This question changed everything. It shifted the focus from blaming my character to examining my strategy. I began a new obsession, but this time, it wasn't a fleeting hobby. It was a deep dive into the psychology of human behavior. I read about behavioral psychology, neuroscience, and surprisingly, the depth psychology of Jung. And from this diverse set of sources, I began to piece together a new model, a new understanding. I synthesized what I learned into what I came to call the 7 psychological laws of unbreakable discipline. These weren't tips or tricks. They were fundamental principles about how our minds actually work. I knew that just learning these laws wasn't enough. I had to prove them. I had to run an experiment on myself. But this time, I would do it differently. I wouldn't pick a huge, ambitious goal. I would pick the smallest, most manageable goal I could think of. My goal was this: to write 100 words a day. That's it, less than a paragraph. It was a goal so small it seemed almost laughable, but its smallness was its strength. It was a perfect laboratory for testing my new system. And so the experiment began. I would apply each of the 7 laws to this one tiny habit. The first law was, make it obvious. My old method was relying on memory and motivation. My new method was to make the cue to write impossible to ignore. I didn't just set a reminder on my phone. I physically altered my environment. I bought a dedicated journal and a pen that I loved to use. And every night, before I went to bed, I would place the open journal and the pen on top of my closed laptop on my desk. The next morning, when I sat down to work, I couldn't even start my day job without physically picking up the journal and moving it. The cue wasn't in my phone. It was in my world. It was unavoidable. The second law was, make it attractive. I had to find a way to link the habit of writing with a feeling of immediate pleasure. I decided to pair it with my morning coffee. I told myself I wasn't allowed to take my first sip of that delicious, life-giving coffee until I had my journal open and my pen in hand. The craving for the coffee became intertwined with the act of starting to write. My brain began to associate the journal not with a chore, but with the rich, aromatic reward of my morning ritual. I was bundling a temptation with a discipline, using my craving to my advantage. The third law was, make it easy. This was where my goal of 100 words became so powerful. The old me would have set a goal of write for an hour or write 2,000 words. That goal is intimidating. It creates a huge wall of resistance. On a day when you're tired or uninspired, the thought of an hour of writing is enough to make you not even start. But 100 words? Anyone can write 100 words. It takes 2 minutes. The starting friction was almost zero. On most days, once I started, I would write much more than 100 words. But on the hard days, on the days I felt tired or resistant, I would just write my 100 words and close the book. And I would still have kept my promise to myself. I was building a chain of consistency, not a monument of intensity. The goal wasn't to write a masterpiece every day. It was to simply show up. The fourth law was, make it satisfying. The human brain prioritizes immediate rewards. The long-term reward of finishing a book is years away, too abstract to power daily action. I needed an immediate hit of satisfaction. So, I got a calendar and a big red marker. Every single day that I wrote my 100 words, I would draw a giant red X over that day. It sounds childish, but the feeling of drawing that X was profoundly satisfying. It was a small, tangible signal of my progress. I was creating a visual record of my consistency. I didn't want to break the chain. That simple, satisfying act of marking the calendar became a powerful motivator in itself. These first 4 laws were about structuring the behavior, but the next 3 were deeper. They were about structuring the mind. The 5th law was the most profound. Integrate the shadow. This was the Jungian principle. The shadow is the part of ourselves we deny, our laziness, our resistance, our desire to quit. My old approach was to fight this shadow, to try to crush it with willpower. When I felt unmotivated, I would berate myself, calling myself lazy. This created an internal war. The new approach was to accept the shadow. I gave myself permission to have bad days. I told myself, there will be days when you do not want to write. There will be days when it feels like a pointless chore. That is okay. That is part of the process. The goal is not to feel inspired every day. The goal is to show up anyway. By accepting my own resistance instead of fighting it, I took away its power. It was no longer a sign of my failure. It was just a predictable weather pattern I had to navigate. The 6th law was, connect the habit to a deep value. A habit built only on superficial goals will crumble. I had to know why I was writing, beyond just wanting to be a writer. I spent time reflecting and journaling about it. I realized that writing wasn't just about a final product. It was about clarifying my own thinking. It was about connecting with myself. It was about creating a small, daily practice of introspection in a noisy world. I wasn't just writing 100 words. I was honoring my value of self-reflection. This deep, intrinsic why was the anchor that held me steady when the surface-level motivation faded. And finally, the 7th law. Create rituals, not decisions. Willpower is a finite resource. Every decision you make during the day depletes it. My old self relied on making a decision every single day. Should I write now or maybe later? This was exhausting. The new approach was to remove the decision entirely by creating a non-negotiable ritual. My ritual was wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, open the journal, write 100 words. It was not a question. It was not up for debate. It was just what I did, like brushing my teeth. By turning the action into an automatic ritual, I preserved my willpower for more important tasks. I was putting my discipline on autopilot. The journey of applying these laws was a quiet, daily practice. There were no dramatic moments of triumph. There were just the small, consistent acts. Placing the journal on the laptop, pairing it with coffee, writing the 100 words, drawing the red X on the calendar. The climax of this story wasn't a heroic act. It wasn't the day I finished a novel or won an award. The climax was a quiet realization that crept up on me about 2 months into the experiment. I was having a particularly stressful morning. I was running late, I had a big deadline at work, and my mind was racing. I sat down at my desk, my mind already jumping to the 100 things I had to do, and without even thinking about it, I reached for my journal, opened it, and wrote a few sentences. And then I stopped. I realized what I had just done. I hadn't made a decision. I hadn't consulted my motivation levels. I hadn't fought a battle with myself. I had just done it. The act of sitting down to write had become so ingrained, so automatic, that it happened without any conscious effort. It had become as effortless as brushing my teeth. In that quiet moment, I felt a profound sense of peace and power. I had done it. I had built a habit that was no longer dependent on my mood or my motivation. It was a part of me. The chain was 60 days long, and its weight felt like an anchor, not a burden. I finally understood. Unbreakable discipline wasn't born from some mystical inner strength or a moment of heroic resolve. It was born from an intelligent, compassionate, and systematic approach. It was born from designing a system where doing the right thing was the easiest thing to do. It wasn't about being stronger than my resistance. It was about making the path of resistance harder to take than the path of discipline. Today, that single small habit has blossomed. I've applied these 7 laws to other areas of my life, to exercise, to meditation, to my finances. The results have been transformative. I am no longer the king of starting. I am a quiet practitioner of finishing. The shame has been replaced by a quiet confidence, not in my own willpower, but in my ability to build systems that support my goals. The great lesson I learned is that discipline is not a moral virtue. It is a skill. It is not about forcing yourself. It is about designing your life. Stop blaming your character and start examining your system. Stop trying to be a hero and start being an architect. Build a structure of obvious cues, attractive rituals, easy actions, and satisfying rewards. Acknowledge your own shadow, connect to your deepest why, and put your habits on autopilot. And what about you? What is the one habit that you believe would change your life if only you had the discipline to stick with it? What is one small, intelligent change you could make to your environment today to make that habit just a little bit easier? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start building.